Good morning. You all probably know this already. I don't choose the lessons Sunday by Sunday, and they are chosen by a committee some years ago, which make up a lectionary, a 3-year cycle of reading. So what we read 3 years ago today was read today, and 3 years from today will be read again. And the creators of the lectionary, as they stitch the readings together for Sunday worship, in the summertime, they gave us stories, mostly from the Old Testament. There's these wonderful long stories that we get to sort of plunge into week by week. Last week, if you were here, we heard the story of Abraham and Sarah, how God came to Abraham and Sarah when Abraham was 75 years old and says, "You're going to have a baby." And we heard how that was probably surprising to them at 75. But what was also probably more surprising is that it would take God at least 24 years to answer that promise. This story, today's story, happens almost in the middle of the longer story of Abraham and Sarah, about 11 years after God came to Abraham and said, "You're going to have a baby," and about 13 years before that baby actually came. And so in this 10, 11 years after that original promise, Abraham and Sarah were obviously pretty excited and confused and scared that they were going to have this baby at 75, right? And then 10 years go past, and they must have thought, is this really going to happen? So about 10, 11 years after that original promise, Abraham and Sarah went with Plan B. And this plan involves a woman who lived in their household named Hagar. So Hagar, some English translations of the Bible call her a servant. Sometimes she's called a maid servant. But those are English translators trying to just soften up the text a little bit and make it a little more palatable. What was she actually? She was a slave. She was from Egypt, we're told multiple times. Abraham and Sarah made a trip through Egypt, and some shenanigans happened in Egypt, which is a story for another time. But we don't know this for sure, but it would make sense if Abraham and Sarah picked up this Egyptian slave girl while they were going through Egypt, right? And then they went on and made their way out of Egypt with her. We know that she's a slave, not only because she's called a slave over and over again, but because she has a slave's name. Slaves oftentimes in the ancient world had peculiar names that went with being a slave. In the New Testament, we'll find some slaves called Primus and Secundus and Tertius. That's kid 1, kid 2, kid 3. You don't name your normal children 1, 2, and 3, but for a slave child, you might do that. There's another slave in the New Testament called Onesimus, which means useful. He was given this name because he was supposed to be hopefully useful to his family. Hagar is a slave name, and it means foreign thing. I heard some mms out there. Certainly, this is not the name that her parents would have given her, right? No one names their child foreign thing. You know how other languages have masculine words and feminine words and neuter words? So there is a Hebrew word for foreign man, there's a Hebrew word for foreign woman, and there's a Hebrew word for a foreign object, a thing, and that is Hagar. She's the foreign thing. She's woman, slave, foreigner. Do you think 5,000 or so years ago you could have gotten much lower on the totem pole than Hagar? So here's the plan B. It's 10, 11 years after the original promise. Things are getting on, and Abraham and Sarah go, let's solve this for ourselves. Sarah goes to Abraham and says, why don't you have a child with Hagar? And then that child will be our child. She's my maidservant, and so it will belong to me. Obviously, this is an ancient form of surrogacy, right? And surrogacy can be a wonderful thing. As an ancient form, there's no middleman, there's no doctor, there's no office visit in between, so it's a little more awkward. It's also awkward because Sarah doesn't go to Hagar and say, hey, what do you think? She goes to Abraham, and Abraham says, fine, let's do this. And they have a child, and his name is Ishmael. And this is from the 16th chapter of Genesis, page 11, if you want to follow along, though you don't have to. He went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she, meaning Sarah, looked with contempt upon her mistress. Like, Sarah has been wanting this child for her entire life, and she's been trying and trying and trying, and obviously it's a deep wound in her heart, and then Hagar gets pregnant like this, and so all of a sudden it's just like, it was supposed to make things feel better, but it didn't. Abram said to Sarah, your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then Sarah dealt harshly with her, and Hagar ran away from her. Would you want to be Hagar? Anyone here have a burning desire? I'd love to be Hagar in this story. No, 100%. But then things turn quite remarkably. In verse 7, chapter 16, the angel of the Lord found her, Hagar, by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I'm running away from my mistress, Sarah. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael. If those words sound familiar at all, it's because we read them almost every Christmas, but in a slightly different form in Luke chapter 1, when the angel Gabriel comes to the Virgin Mary and says, and now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. Now you have conceived and shall bear a son, and you shall name him Ishmael. The same words that are used at the Annunciation to herald the birth of Christ are almost the exact same words used to Hagar to herald the birth of her son. It's stunning. It's remarkable. In verse 13, perhaps the most remarkable verse of the story, so she, Hagar, named the Lord. Wait, what? She gave God a name. She called him, you are El Roi, which means the God who sees. Why does she call him the God who sees? Because she, who had never been seen by anyone in her entire life, woman, slave, foreigner, 5,000 years ago, no one bothered with her, looked at her, cared for her. Even when she was going along with the family plan, they're still heaping contempt and scorn upon her. She, God, saw her. God is the God who sees, the one in affliction, the one who is cast down. Which then brings us to today's story, a couple chapters further in chapter 21, where we then move ahead about 13 years when Isaac is born. So Abraham and Sarah do have this son Isaac, and then we also have this other son, Ishmael. The child Isaac grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. If we were watching this in a movie or television form, the music under that would be incredibly ominous. Sarah looks upon her child, her blessed child that she had been waiting 100 years for, and she sees him playing with the foreign things kid. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit along with my son." Abraham rose early in the morning. He took bread and water and gave it to Hagar. Remember last week's story when the three visitors come to Abraham and Sarah? Abraham and Sarah just put on a lavish feast, right? They kill the calf. They have fresh baked bread. Abraham goes in, starts making cheese by hand. Here, when Abraham is sending Hagar and his son off, little bread, little water. Off she goes. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes, and she walks away because she does not want to see the child die of exposure. Now, if you've ever seen an artistic depiction of this scene, it's almost always Hagar woman with an infant sitting under a tree, as if we're letting an infant out. In the lines of the story, however, if you do the math, Ishmael is about 15 years old, which changes the story dramatically. At 15 years old, Ishmael would have been fully aware of what's going on. And so the boy cries. And she lifted up her voice and wept. In verse 17 of the 21st chapter, and God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is." In the first part of the story, God is the God who sees. Now he's the God who hears. And he lifts up Ishmael. Ishmael goes off to live a full life. He has 12 sons, and his sons become the head of a nation, just like the 12 sons of Jacob will become the nation of Israel. So I started this sermon off by saying the lectionary gives us these fun stories in the summer. You feeling a very fun story here? This is an uncomfortable story, right? And it's so uncomfortable, it makes me wonder why it was included. Like, it doesn't cast Abraham in the best light. It definitely does not cast Sarah in the best light at all. I mean, last week I told the story from 35,000 feet, and they are just paragons of faith and virtue. But you kind of go into the middle of the story, and there's this other thing going on. You go, well, I don't know about that. The story of Abraham and Sarah didn't need this whole thing. If the scriptures needed to tell us that Ishmael was born, they could have done that in a sentence or two and left out all the other unpleasant bits. Which tells me that there had to have been a reason why, at the expense of some of the reputation of Abraham and Sarah, this story was told with such fullness. It would not be many generations after this, many generations after Abraham and Sarah, that Abraham and Sarah's descendants would be a small nation. But they would not have their own land. They would be in another land, in Egypt, and they would be slaves. 1500 BC, there was almost no bits of scripture written down yet. But the stories would have begun to have been told. Can you imagine being an Israelite slave in a foreign country, hearing around the campfire the story of Hagar, foreign woman, slave, who God saw and exalted. And Ishmael, the son of this slave, who was heard. This is Hagar and Ishmael. Hagar is the first person that God comes to outside of Eden. Can you imagine sitting in the slave fields of Egypt and hearing about that slave who God saw? If God could see Hagar, the foreign thing, perhaps God could see us too. It would be 900 years after their slavery in Egypt that the Israelites would be slaves again. They would be slaves just in a different country, in Babylon. So again, they're foreign slaves in a foreign land. And this time, a lot of the scriptures that we have now are written down. And so they would have had this story of Hagar. Can you imagine sitting in Babylon as a slave and reading this story about Hagar, the slave foreign thing that God saw, and her son that God heard? Perhaps if God saw and heard them, perhaps God would see and hear us. I also wonder if this story wasn't just meant for Israel's lowest times, but also for the times in between, to remind them that when they were tempted to oppress and hurt and be mean to other people, that this story would be a reminder that, oh, no, those people who we're oppressing and being mean to and throwing all our hatred on, God sees them. God hears them. God loves them too. There are always invisible people that society does not see. It was true 5,000 years ago. It is true today. There are so many things in our society that can render you invisible. Poverty is one of them. We don't like seeing it. It hurts our eyes and our hearts, and so we just don't want to look. How many times, walking down the streets of New York City or Philadelphia, do you see a homeless person there, and hundreds or thousands of people are walking by looking like laser-like ahead of them? You don't want to meet eyes with this person over here. Or the guys who stand with the little bits of cardboard at the tunnel asking for help. Like, again, you are never more focused on the road than you are right then. Disability, illness can render people invisible. We're reading a book on Tuesday nights on grief and mourning. Grief can render you invisible. It's uncomfortable to be around someone who is crying and just their heart breaking, and so people just can turn away. This story is a reminder to us 5,000 years later that the people that are invisible in our society might be invisible to us, but they are not invisible to God. God sees them and hears them. And every single one of us in this room have at one time felt invisible, felt alone, felt forgotten. It was either on the schoolyard of our childhoods, or it was at the water cooler at the office, or it was something strange and awful going on in our family. We felt on the outside. We felt forgotten. We felt lost. And sometimes it was a small deal, and sometimes it was a huge deal, and it consumed our lives. And perhaps you feel invisible today. And this story, the story of Hagar, reminds us that our God sees. And our God sees you. On the best of days and on the worst of our days. We usually think of Abraham and Sarah as being these giants of faith, and they are. They are also human beings and capable of being imperfect, wildly imperfect at times. But they are examples of faith to us. But so is Hagar. Do not forget her. Do not forget the Hagars that live around us. And know that the Hagar who lives inside you is not forgotten either. For our God is the God who sees.